Question, is quid pro quo a euphemism for extortion or bribery? Let's get an assessment on that from criminal defense attorney and legal analyst Trent Copeland, who joins us here in studio. All right, is it?
It's a euphemism, and it's not a very good one, and it certainly doesn't even really apply to what's happened in this case. I mean, look, let's stop with the Latin. Normal people don't understand it. I took Latin in high school and college. I don't even understand it. But the truth is, this isn't a quid pro quo. This is extortion. It's bribery. It's been enumerated in the Constitution, and let's call it for what it is. And as we begin these impeachment hearings, with the Democrats bringing forward these witnesses, live witnesses, up the hill in front of Congress on Wednesday, let's call this what it is and not a quid pro quo, because I think we fall right into, whether you are whichever side of the political spectrum you're on, let's call it what it is so the public understands. Is it important for the public to know whether or not the President of the United States engaged in some criminal wrongdoing, whether it's extortion or bribery? Let's not call it quid pro quo.
What will Trent Copeland be looking for this week?
The first thing is I'm going to watch the interest of the public. You know, they say repetition is the mother of all learning. Many of these witnesses, Larry, have testified both in closed-door session. They've testified in front of small groups of congressmen. They're now, for the third time, going to testify in open session. I think the public needs to see this. I want to know whether or not these witnesses, career diplomats, some of whom were appointed by President Trump himself, I want to know whether or not their testimony, when they swear and they raise their hand to tell the truth, whether or not that begins to resonate with the public. I want to see whether or not they point out the elements of the crime associated with whether or not this was extortion or bribery. I've got no dog in the fight. I'm picking no sides, but I think the public, the American public, needs to know whether or not this is, on one side or the other, criminal or not.
From what you've seen or heard thus far, from the testimony released, wouldn't you say that you come down on the side of this being extortion?
Absolutely. So now some people, Larry, and I think you're right, some people have said, look, if the president engaged in this conduct, it is maybe bribery. And bribery is enumerated, by the way, in our Constitution as being an example of an impeachable offense. It doesn't have to be the only one. There can also be other high crimes and misdemeanors. In my view, and I think as you suggested, Larry, this is extortion. This is the President of the United States, if true, the President of the United States taking money that has been congressionally funded, money that has been apportioned to give to the Ukrainians in their fight against Russia, annexing Crimea, further encroaching into their territory, taking that money and holding it up and saying, hey, look, if you want the money, you've got to do three things for me. And those three things are, you say the words Clinton, Biden, investigation. You say those three words, do those three things for me, then you're going to get the money. If you don't do those things, I'm holding up the money. That's extortion in any jurisdiction, in any federal court, on any given day.
What do you think about refusals of members of the Trump administration refusing to testify? And if they knew about Sondland in the first place, they wouldn't have let him come.
I don't know what to say of it, Larry. I really don't. It used to be that when you received a congressional subpoena, you complied. It used to be that when the long arm of the federal government reached out towards you, you answered. I don't know what this is all about. I went to law school in Washington, D.C. During the period of time, Larry, when you lived in D.C. I spent a lot of time on the Hill, intern. I understand how these things should work. These things are no longer working the way they should. The mechanisms of the government have been so contorted, have been so distorted, that I don't know what is up and what's down. And the idea that congressmen are encouraging civilian witnesses to disobey properly served congressional subpoenas is beyond the pale.
As an attorney, what do you make of the story of Rudy Giuliani?
You know, Larry, I've said this to you before many times. I was a big fan of Mayor Giuliani, particularly how he handled 9/11, post-New York City. He was America's mayor. I don't think anyone could disagree that he did a fantastic job. I don't recognize this iteration of Rudy Giuliani. I just don't.
What's your assessment of Attorney General Barr?
Well, first of all, he, again, Larry, has operated in a way that is inconsistent than any attorney general in our nation's history. He has, in an effort to shield Donald Trump from any criminal liability, any criminal sanction, he has essentially said, listen, whatever Trump does, I'm going to find a way to shield him from it. In fact, he's become his sort of John the Baptist, right? His job is to wash away the sins, to wash away the dirt. Whatever it is that Donald Trump is engaged in, his view is to be that gatekeeper to stop it from becoming a full-blown criminal investigation. And that is not the role of an attorney general. He has so obscured that role and is so, in some ways, Larry, I think that he has denigrated the office of attorney general in a way that it's hard to imagine.
I've never asked you this, but can you define high crimes and misdemeanors? Because I look at it, and I know the founding fathers were pretty smart. If you murder someone, that's a high crime. If you park illegally in the red zone, that's a misdemeanor. Explain this to me.
Well, it doesn't have to be necessarily, your description of it is entirely accurate. Those crimes are enumerated in the Constitution as being enough to impeach a president. But it doesn't just have to be high crimes and misdemeanors. Those were examples. Abuses of power, not enumerated in the Constitution, can also constitute behavior that is enough to impeach the president.
As a misdemeanor.
As a misdemeanor. Now, look, do we want to impeach a president because he jaywalked? Do we want to impeach a president because he engaged he had a parking meter violation? Do we want to impeach the president over smaller, minor offenses? Of course not. And the Founding Fathers didn't anticipate that we would have this kind of lawlessness in the White House. But what they did anticipate is that Congress, on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, would uphold the rule of law and hold a president accountable if he engaged in conduct that was in some way a violation of law.
Trent, always love having you on.
Always a pleasure, Larry.